In this video, we'll be looking at human impact, and this topic is covered in both grade 11 and grade 12 content. I do find this a very interesting topic. I know a lot of you might find it a little bit boring, but have an open mind and you'll see it's actually not that bad, and it might make for some easy marks if you put in the effort. So with human impact, what is it about? It's basically everything that humans do that impacts the environment in a nutshell. So we have the ability to shape our environment to suit us, but this is, however, not always beneficial to the environment, as it may have major impacts on the environment around us. So starting off with human impact, the first subtopic that we'll be looking at is the greenhouse effect. And we actually do need the greenhouse effects. The natural greenhouse effect is necessary for us to be able to live on Earth, because without the greenhouse effect, it would be like living in a freezer. You would not be able to survive, nothing would grow, it would be extremely, extremely cold. I think it's something like minus 18 degrees Celsius, which is freezing. So the basics of the greenhouse effect is that radiant energy from the sun penetrates our atmosphere. As soon as that radiant energy hits the Earth's surface, it will warm it up a bit, and then the radiant energy will escape back out into space and will leave the Earth's atmosphere. All the while, it has just heated the Earth up enough for us to be able to live on it. So that is the greenhouse effect, and it is extremely necessary. Now, there are some gases that are present in our atmosphere that help with trapping just a little bit of that radiant energy that will help maintain the Earth's temperature. And those greenhouse gases are carbon dioxide. Just please remember that on this program I cannot have a subscript, so remember carbon dioxide looks like that, water like that, methane like that, ozone, and nitrous oxide. Just so you write it correctly and not like this, because that is incorrect. So carbon dioxide, water vapor, methane, and surface ozone, as well as nitrous oxide, are the greenhouse gases that we will find in the atmosphere that help trap some of that radiant energy. Now, the bad thing comes in with the greenhouse effect is the enhanced greenhouse effect. That means that this is times 50. And this is because there are more of these greenhouse gases that are being released up into the atmosphere because of human activity. And it's generally human fossil fuel use that has increased drastically over the past few years. And with that, also the greenhouse gases. Now, these gases intensify the greenhouse effect, which causes a change in the Earth's temperature. So more radiant energy is trapped by these gases in the atmosphere, and you don't get the radiant energy that escapes into space. They all get trapped, the radiant energy gets trapped, and that just causes an increase in global temperatures. And that is what we do not want. Now, trees can act as carbon sinks. So basically, trees help get rid of carbon dioxide because they use it in the process of photosynthesis. But trees also get removed due to deforestation, which we'll look at a little bit later. And that means that less carbon dioxide gets absorbed. Now, how can we reduce greenhouse gases? So improve international cooperation, legislation, and introduce incentives. You'll see a lot of these, how we can reduce greenhouse gases, how can we reduce global warming. A lot of these points will come up multiple times, so that's easy studying. Moving on to carbon dioxide, so we're going to look at each of these greenhouse gases, specifically looking at methane and carbon dioxide in a bit more detail so that we can understand what their impact is. So the main source of emissions with carbon dioxide, once again, human activities, and this comes when we use coal, petrol, diesel, oil, and natural gas. So the main sources of carbon dioxide emissions is found in transport, electricity, which is actually the most, it's the largest source of carbon dioxide emissions when we want electricity produced, and then industries. So many industrial processes actually burn fossil fuels, and during that time, with the chemical reactions, there's carbon dioxide that is released. And then also petrol and diesel that are used as a fuel source for cars and trucks. looking at these pictures, I mean, it's very sad that the natural beauty of the environment has been taken away by pollution. So electricity production, and then because of human population increase, you'll see that there are more cars on the roads, and sometimes you'll have one person in one car where people do not make use of public transport, and it just has a major effect on the amount of carbon dioxide or greenhouse gases that is emitted. I mean, here you can't even see past this truck. You barely see those motorcycles there. So how can we reduce our carbon dioxide emissions? By saving electricity, by switching off lights when you exit a room, or by actually plugging out your chargers from the socket in the wall, because they actually do pull electricity even though you're not charging your phone. Introduce stricter measures against excessive carbon dioxide release. This is more on a government level. Create awareness of excessive release of carbon dioxide. Most of you would have seen posters of how we can reduce global warming and all of that. So nothing strange there. And then introduce incentives. People like to be rewarded if they do something great these days. I mean, it's a total different world. Then we'll look at methane emissions now. So methane has a bigger effect in trapping heat energy because it's more efficient in trapping the heat. And then it is also released during decomposition and fermentation of organic material. So if you've ever driven past a wetland or a river or a marshy area or anywhere where there's reeds or plant growth, you would have smelled like a sewer smell, like somebody has farted in the surrounding area, and that is because of the decomposition process of the organic material that causes that smell, and that smell is methane that you are smelling. So what are the main sources of methane emissions? So in industries, so crude oil production, refining, transportation and storage. Agriculture actually plays a big role. The past few years there's been an incentive to have meatless Mondays. So just for one day of the week, people are encouraged not to eat meat. And the big reason for that is because livestock actually produce methane in their feces, and also the stored manure also generates methane. So the thought pattern behind that is when people eat one day less in a week, they eat meat, there'll be less methane that is produced because there'll be far less livestock that have to be produced to feed people. Then rice plantation. So if you did not know what a rice plantation looks like, this is what it looks like. It's a very watery area in which it has to grow. Rice plantations are a big source of methane production, and then as well as waste from houses and businesses. So municipal landfills, waste rots and decomposes. I'm talking about vegetable peels and all of those kinds of things that you could actually be composting in your garden. And then purification of sewage. As soon as you flush the toilet, that all goes to a sewage treatment plant, and it turns the loo water into drink water that goes back into your tap. But obviously, feces causes methane production, so this is also another major source of methane emissions. So how can we reduce methane emissions? Reduce or find alternatives for the use of fossil fuels. Reduced waste production by humans, and then use methane as an alternative fuel or energy source. There's quite a few farms that have started to take the manure that is produced by livestock, and they take that into holding tanks where bacteria help decompose it, and that methane that is then generated is caught and it is stored, and then it is used as an alternative source of fuel. Carbon footprint. So basically the carbon footprint, or your carbon footprint, is the sum of all the carbon dioxide emissions resulting from someone's activities in a given period. So basically it's your lifestyle's impact on global warming, and humans contribute to the amount of carbon dioxide in the air, and thus we have been able to measure how much that is, which is then the carbon footprint. So fuel consumption is the most common way of measuring your footprint, and it is determined by the amount of energy you use to heat your home, your use of electrical and electronic equipment, your daily transport, and how often you use air transport. So this just summarizes quite nicely everything that has an impact on your carbon footprint: the amount of fuel you consume, type of transport you use, the amount of electricity, your offsets, recycling, gas, and then the amount of waste that you generate all have an impact on your carbon footprint. So how can we reduce carbon footprint? How can you reduce that? By insulating your home. This doesn't necessarily pertain to South Africa as much because we don't have as harsh winters as overseas, but when you insulate your home, it reduces the amount of energy that is needed to heat your house in the winter and cool it in the summer. Then buy energy saving equipment or appliances. For example, swap out all your normal light bulbs with LED light bulbs. Then use alternative energy sources such as solar heating. Solar power is becoming a major thing. Support local produce or grow your own fruit and vegetables in your own garden. Switch off your electronic equipment at the wall sockets. In fact, pull it out completely. Walk, cycle, or use public transport. Use less air transport. Reduce, reuse, and recycle, which we'll look at a bit later on. Moving on to global warming. So this is also quite an interesting topic, and there's a lot of information available about it, specifically a lot of movies that are available. So global warming is a rise in global temperatures, which leads to drastic climate changes. So we say global warming, but the better term to use is climate change, because not everywhere in the world it will be affected with warming. In some areas you'll have cooler temperatures, for example. If you want to do some extracurricular activities or watch a movie or a documentary in between breaks, there's quite a few available. So there's An Inconvenient Truth, directed, and I think it's also produced by Al Gore, former Vice President of America. He also has a sequel. So An Inconvenient Truth was, I think, released in 2005 or 6, and then An Inconvenient sequel was released a few years ago. And then there's also the Leonardo DiCaprio movie called Before the Flood. Then there's also a new movie with Woody Harrelson that was released on Netflix. I think it's called Kiss the Ground. And then there's also the David Attenborough documentary that was just released. It basically follows his life on Earth and how it has changed. I think it's a lifetime on Earth or something like that, but you'll find it on Netflix. So if you want to go watch those, they're pretty interesting. Might give you a different perspective on these topics just to see it as well. So what are the causes of global warming? It's due to an increase in greenhouse gases. So specifically they're referencing enhanced greenhouse effect. So the greenhouse effect is necessary, but the enhanced greenhouse effect is the bad one. Now, what are the effects of these on global warming? So firstly, you're going to have an increase in extreme weather conditions. So these extreme weather conditions include floods, droughts and heat waves, desertification, which is the process through which semi-arid or arid land is transformed into a desert, and then tropical cyclones are more frequent and stronger. So you get these cyclones that become category 5 cyclones, and they just decimate everything in their path, and this is the aftermath of such a cyclone. Then desertification. So you can clearly see where this fence is, there's a stark difference between the left and the right side. So on the right side, this area is actually busy turning into a desert, and very shortly there'll be no plant life left there. Whereas on the left side, there's still some plant life left, and this will also come in with poor farming practices, which we'll look at a bit later, but nothing will grow there. Then droughts and heat waves. So South Africa last year experienced quite severe droughts. Cape Town on the way of having to become the first city in the world where there was no water ever in the history of Earth. So that's pretty bad. This is a municipal dam in the Karoo. I can't remember where it was, but this is a municipal dam, so this dam was supposed to provide water for the whole town. Look at how far that guy can stick his hand into those cracks there. This is horrible. I remember when I showed these pictures to some of my learners, they asked me if this was photoshopped, and it definitely is not. In fact, it made international news. I actually found this picture in the New York Post, article in the New York Post from America. So just as there are severe droughts in one area of the country, the other part of the country could be experiencing severe floods. So these are floods that happened in Gauteng in 2016. This is on the highway. The highway is a river. This is extremely dangerous, and some of these people's cars were obviously lost in the aftermath of that flood. Another thing that is caused by global warming is the polar ice caps that are melting, as well as glaciers, and this has a ripple effect with rising sea levels, which will cause flooding in certain areas, sea current changes, rise in sea surface temperatures. And just to show you the impact of what it looks like when glaciers melt, just to see it visually. So this is a glacier. This picture was taken in 1913. I think this is it's an overflow on the right hand side. So this was in 2012. So you can see that this glacier has completely disappeared. The ice coverage in the Arctic it's reduced almost to half its size. This is I don't have the dates or differences here, but you can see how much that glacier was reduced. On the left hand side here, this is the Columbia Glacier in Alaska, and the one on the left is from 2009, the one on the right is from 2015. It has been reduced by 6.5 kilometers. This was all ice coverage. It's gone, which is pretty sad. The Thrift Glacier in Switzerland, this was in 2006 on the left. This is in 2015 on the right once again. And it has been reduced by 1.7 kilometers. So it's gone all the way up there that this glacier has been reduced. And this also has an effect on polar bears. So polar bears are for the first time drowning and starving because they cannot cover the vast distances between these glaciers, and they're not getting enough food in. They are now being pushed further and further into towns because some of the Alaskan towns are on their migration route, so there's more interaction with humans, which is becoming dangerous. Polar bears and people are getting killed, which is quite sad as well. Not only affects the glaciers, but also the coral. So coral is very sensitive to sea temperatures, and because the ocean surface temperatures are also rising, this is normal coral, and then bleaching occurs because of the rise in temperatures. So once again, normal coral on the left and then bleached coral on the right. And these coral provide a habitat and various other things for marine life. And because they are getting destroyed, you'll see that there's very little marine life left in the area. Then loss of biodiversity, so plant and animal species become extinct, especially vulnerable species. So there's a whole list. The list is so long, it's very difficult to put everything in the video, but one of the animals that comes to mind immediately is orangutans that are losing their habitat because of palm oil in the palm oil industry. So do not buy any products that are made from palm oil. That directly affects them. There's just too many animals to mention. Then mutually dependent species don't have the same life cycles, such as bees and flowers, and then they cannot survive because the bees cannot pollinate the flowers, so the flowers die off. The bees do not get honey, or they cannot produce honey. They cannot get nectar. So it's a whole ripple effect. Then global food and water shortages. Areas are experiencing droughts, people cannot get water, and because of that they cannot water their crops. Look at the cracks there in what is supposed to be very fertile soil so they can grow their food. Then there's also the spread of disease. Some cities were founded because they were, for example, above the mosquito line, so The mosquitoes only went up until a certain point because of elevation and temperature. But now with global temperature increases, that is no longer the case anymore. Mosquitoes are going higher up, and those areas are now for the first time experiencing malaria. Then the seawater becomes more acidic, which also can lead to bleaching and animals not being able to adapt in their new environments. What can we do to combat global warming? Firstly, we can implement strategies to improve energy efficiency, develop technology to improve fuel economy. That's already being done by most companies. I think it's Volkswagen that has a blue line. BMW also has some electric cars out. Tesla. There's a whole lot of companies that are jumping onto that bandwagon. Then using alternative energy sources, so wind and solar power, hydrogen, methane, biofuels, natural gas, nuclear power. All of these need to be refined a bit more. I'm sure that, the technology will obviously change so much, and maybe one of you will be able to help with that in finding new alternative energy sources. Then the planting of forests, so that is called afforestation instead of deforestation, and this will also decrease the carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. This is the end of this video. In the next one, we'll be looking at deforestation and the rest of the topics.